Welcome to the Roost. In this month's TTRPG video, we're making some magic items, specifically swords. In September, I participated in Swordtember using prompts from Faith Schaefer on Blue Sky to inspire some sketches. I did 13 swords, which seems like an appropriate number for October, so I'm converting them into digital form, coloring them in, and in today's video, I'll be turning them into D&D 5e compatible magic items. I'm leaving it open-ended whether I'll convert them into Daggerheart items or other systems in a future video, but for now, let's get to it. So starting off with the prompt from day 1, shell, I immediately thought of the spiral shells I would find on the beach. I didn't want it to be just one shell though, so I made the hilt a different shape. And I ended up choosing a spiral auger shell, which I didn't know was what they were called, and then a scallop shape for the hilt. For the name, I started off with Shellspire, thinking it might make for a good bard's rapier with the inspiration, but I decided to rename it later. For the description, I liked the idea of making it have a scent and a sound, like when you hold a seashell up to your ear and can quote-unquote hear the ocean. And what better way to bring the ocean through a sword than to cast Tidal Wave through it. I also wanted to deal a little extra damage, so I gave it a +1 and gave it some water properties, giving the attuned player a swim speed and the ability to breathe underwater. I thought that was only fair given the theme of the day. Finally, revisiting the name, I thought Wave Warden could be cool. I was also afraid that I was kind of ripping off Dimension 20 because of Theobald Gumbar's shield from Crown of Candy, but that's actually called Swirl Warden, the sucker shield for the lollipop, not because it has anything to do with waves or the ocean. So, Wave Warden it is. This is one of my favorite designs. I love the color scheme, I love how it turned out, and I want to put it in a game ASAP. The next sword is based on day 3 of Swordtember, Automaton. I had two initial thoughts, that this weapon was part of a construct, kind of built like a sword arm, and the blade should extend like a switchblade. I don't know why those were my first two thoughts, but I went with them, and I really like how the colors ultimately turned out. For the magical properties, I still wanted this to act like an attachable arm. You can use it like a regular sword as well, but I liked the idea of fighting something mechanical like a transformer where it was built in, or like a construct or a golem, something built like Alphonse from Full Metal Alchemist, just like this big metal body with this metallic built-in sword. The light design on the bicep shoulder part was originally just aesthetic, but when it came down to the magical properties, I knew that they should actually serve a purpose, so I made this a magic absorbing sword. It works like a ring of spell storing, with casters able to store specific spells in there, but I also wanted it to do more. I thought about it giving it absorb elements, but I didn't want all these swords to just also be able to cast a spell. I wanted something a little bit more unique. So instead, this sword can counter spells being cast as long as there are slots available to match the spell. So if someone's casting a level 3 fireball and you have a feather fall and 4 empty slots in there, you can absorb that level 3 fireball. But if the caster is casting a level 7 fireball, you don't have enough slots in there because there's only 5 slots in the sword. It's meant to be a good build for a Mage Slayer, and in order to make sure that there's some sort of balance, the slots that you expend by absorbing magic can't be used again until a long rest. But it does convert the used energy into temporary hit points for the day, which I think is pretty cool. I did originally forget to name this sword, but I go back in a minute and name it appropriately, Spellbane. The third sword I did on day 5 was Bell. I loved the idea of ringing your sword like a handbell, and of course I thought about the Toll the Dead cantrip, given that a bell is the key concept. I also liked the idea of a cleric going about their priestly business in a church and then stabbing a demon or something with like just their little handbell that they keep on their belt or something, like almost like a dagger. It's innocuous, it sounds pretty, it can be played at funeral rites or weddings or worship, and no one would suspect that this, innocent little cleric or priest has this dagger. The rubies took me what felt like forever to get right, but I'm glad I added a bit of dimension to them. There's something about this gold and red color scheme that really gets to me. I'm usually more of a silver and blue kind of girl when it comes to like jewelry and dice, really anything. But apparently I like coloring red and gold. It's a good theme. I did consider letting this dagger do more, magically speaking, but the concept was intended to be pretty simple, so I added some extra necrotic damage, made sure that Toll the Dead was upcasted to a mid-level cantrip damage, but otherwise let it be what it is, a semi-disguised cleric's weapon and tool. For day 7, we have Clock, and so I drew Clock Hands. Originally, it was just going to be a spear, but I liked the idea of this detachable set of weapons, especially mirroring the shorter and longer lengths of the minute and hour hands. But when, they're at 12 and 6 or 3 and 9 or just anywhere across from each other on the face of a clock, I liked that idea of a longer weapon. So they are this detachable and reattachable set. When it came time to naming the individual weapons and their properties, I went down a rabbit hole of clockwork terminology to look for inspiration. I ended up with Sweep and Bezel. Sweep is the motion of the hands on a clock face, and Bezel is the groove that a watch or clock crystal sits in. So I liked those names, I went with them, and then together they're called the Hands of Time. For the longer weapon, I played around with it being a sword or a spear or a rapier, but I did eventually land on javelin, and then the shorter one is a dagger. And then together they make a dual-headed or double-bladed, depending on how you think about it, spear. In order to make it as simple as possible, I gave all the blades +2 to attacks and damage, and each form of the weapon an ability that They all shared 10 charges and could use and expend those charges individually to use those abilities. Which, the abilities are pretty simple, but I think they're pretty powerful, so this is a legendary kind of artifact type of weapon. So apart, the javelin can use wind up to extend its range and automatically return to the thrower's hand, which I think is always useful for a ranged weapon that you want to consistently use. And then the dagger can use mainspring to deal a significant amount of extra damage. Together, I had to let this clock-themed weapon cast Time Stop with the timeout ability. It just was too good of an opportunity, but because it's a 9th level spell, it does use most of the charges, and the weapons do recharge at a relatively slow rate of 1d6 plus 1 per day. And if all 10 charges are ever expended, they become non-magical weapons. So there is a pretty high cost to that. I thought it was a pretty good balance. I would love to give this weapon some history and backstory if I were ever to use it in a game, just given its legendary status. But for now, I'll leave it at that. I did the 5th sword on day 10 of Swordtember, Rodent. I wasn't originally going to do this prompt. I didn't have an idea, and I don't particularly like rodents, but at the last minute I was inspired to use a bone, sort of tooth-shaped double blade. And so the prisoner's shiv idea came to me as I was designing the magical properties, because why would anyone have a dagger like this? Who would be so inspired to make and use it? Maybe a prisoner who had slept with rats and needed some handmade protection. I thought of it making it like a sharp weapon, which deals extra damage, but I didn't like the lopping off limbs part for this design, so instead I just let it crit more easily. Double the blades, higher the chance of hitting something vital, but it is just a dagger, so I maintained the usual d4 damage die and gave it just a little extra oomph, because let's be honest, even critting with a 1d4 dagger kind of sucks. It doesn't feel good, unless you're rogue and can add 66 sneak attack damage, but I wanted to give it a little extra. While I was doing the line art, I did make a couple of design changes to this one and a couple of the other swords as I was converting them to digital versions. I wanted the teeth on this one to feel a little bit more lifelike rather than a flat 2D image, so I gave them some dimension, and I really like the scratches I added at the end to give them kind of a used, dirty appearance. And then I also added this piercing effect with a little red, just for flavor. Day 13 of Swordtember was Bloom, and I don't know why I gave it this extra pointy part on the side of the blade, but when I tell you I went down a rabbit hole for the name, I am not kidding. I started looking at sword types and designs, which I didn't do at all when I did the original pencil sketches for any of these, and I ended up looking at early European polearms. The closest I can find to this kind of blade design is a Guisarme, and I can't help but say that word in that weird accent. I don't know why. It definitely doesn't belong on a sword. The closest I could find to this kind of design on a sword was a sai, which in my opinion more resembles a trident-shaped dagger, but ultimately I like the design that I ended up with. In the original sketch, the hilt was supposed to be covered in leaves, and I dabbled with the idea of the handle being webbed, like spidery kind of designs in there. But I 100% changed tacks and went with gold or red, go figure, on the crossguard, and then a stained glass look near the grip, which I wasn't expecting, but I really loved the result. The colors were really fun. and that design inspired the magical properties. I knew I wanted the effect to be something like Hypnotic Pattern, but I didn't want it to just be a recasting of the spell, so I made it a once per day effect of the sword on a single target. And I gave it some extra damage because I love swords that deal more than their base damage. It makes just having the magical sword feel good. The next sword is based off of Day 17's prompt, Gem. I went more of a crystal-inspired route and really liked the jagged edges that I ended up with. I imagine it being kind of like a great sword or club alternative. And I imagine it really fitting a New Age barbarian or even like a druid multi-class. I did make the crossguard and grip into these cut gem shapes to stay at least a little true to the gem prompt. And when I first started coloring it, you'll see I started with the red, and I thought about keeping it as like a pure ruby red. But as soon as I picked out the purple to give it some depth, I knew that I needed more of a multicolored crystal concept. So I added in some blues. It was a lot of fun to get these colors to blend and separate in their different spots. And the colors reminded me of costume jewelry, especially kind of like the clear glass-like pieces that you might see where it's sort of transparent. So I went with Scry, being one of the associated spells for the sword. I was also still thinking about the magical absorption from the automaton sword, which I had considered using, absorb elements for, but I liked the sorcerer and wizard transmute damage ability better. So I went with that here instead, being able to change the elemental damage type that the sword deals. I also went down a rabbit hole looking at geology and mineral terms here, looking for a good name. There's some really cool terms in science. When in doubt, I go to the internet and look for niche subject matter and science terms because it all sounds strange and fantastical and serves as great inspiration. But ultimately, I stuck with the simple Seer's Blade for the name, went with Crystallomancy for the Scry spell ability, and then just a simple Transmute Elements for the last ability. Day 20 was Vapor, and I definitely took inspiration from a pirate sword for this one. All I could think about were those thick, kind of like cartoony scimitar swords, so I gave this blade a very simple but thick shape. I knew I wanted to show condensation or water dripping from it. The original pencil sketch definitely made me think of blood dripping from it, so I'm really glad I colored it in and got to show the wavy kind of water reflective surface on the blade and in the droplets falling from it. For the magical properties, I went pure spellcasting on this one. I didn't want to overlap too much with the Wave Warden shell sword, so I looked up some 5e water spells and took one from the first few levels of spellcasting. Create and Destroy Water, and then Wall of Water. And then for the last two spells, I just tweaked existing druid spells, Warding Wind and Conjure Elemental, so that they were water themed. So instead of Warding Wind, it's Warding Water, and Conjure Elemental can only summon water elementals. For the name, again, thinking more ocean rather than beach, I went with a simple nautical Fathom. I thought about nicknaming it the Pirate's Blade, but I had just named the Seer's Blade and wanted something a little bit more unique. Day 21 was Ring, and at first I was at a loss for how to design this blade. But then I thought about those basket hilts that some swords have, the very fancy, ornate cross guard and hand guards, and I thought it would be really cool to have these overlapping rings guarding the sword hand. I wanted to use a very different shape for the blade, so I sketched out this huge kind of diamond-esque shape, and I wanted more than just the handle to be on brand for the prompt, so I cut out little rings from the blade itself. I was almost thinking about like woodwind instruments or the sound that a sword makes when you swing it through the air. I thought that the rings could lend like a very intimidating air to have them whistle as it is swung. I built on that kind of theme of sound and whistling by adding some extra thunder damage to the sword and gave it the ability to deafen an enemy a few times per day. It's a pretty straightforward build, magically speaking, but I think it looks intimidating and could be really useful in a situation where the bad guy is commanding their minions around a battlefield. For example, common option is to use their reaction to move and make an attack, but if they can't hear their commander, maybe they can't do that. So that would be really cool. And then I named it Shrieker because I just think that's a very appropriate name. Finally, for the last 4 days of Swordtember, there were prompts for each of the seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. I was inspired by the Aladdin for this sword because they can take on different appearances based on the season. So I redrew the same sword each day with different designs based off of the theme, and gave each design a different ability. So I called it the Perennial sword, like the flowers that come back year after year, and gave each appearance for each season a different ability. In summer, the sword emits a very bright light, deals only radiant damage, so no piercing, slashing, any of that, and can deal some extra damage a limited number of times. In autumn, it takes on a jack-o'-lantern-like appearance, very appropriate for October. So it has these glowing triangle eyes on the hilt. I was really happy with those. And then it grants advantage on stealth and intimidation. It also grants some dark vision, which is useful. So more skill check abilities here for the autumn portion of the sword. So in spring, the wielder can cast Entangle and Grasping Vine from the blooms and greenery surrounding the hilt and blade. And finally, in winter, the icicles grow over the sword and it deals only cold damage. And then I gave it this almost like firestorm ability where once per long rest, the icicles explode and deal 10d8 bludgeoning and cold damage. It's like a very major upgrade to Ice Knife. The wielder can change the sword's appearance, but only at the end of a long rest, so it does take some planning to use very well, but there's a lot of versatility in this single weapon. I can imagine plenty of story arcs using this sword where maybe it was tampered with or cursed, and the player has to journey to unlock the various abilities and forms. Something like that. There are so many possibilities, but that's the big one that I thought of while I was designing this one. And that's a wrap on building magic swords for D&D 5th edition. I'm going to add the illustrations to this document and try to make it available for a free download. If there's a place you all like to download this sort of homebrew, like Itch or DriveThruRPG, or etc., let me know which one you prefer down in the comments and I'll see what I can do. If this is something you want to see more of, if you want me to convert these items to Daggerheart or another system, leave a like on the video and I'll catch you in the next one.